Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. First of all, I'm Juan Carlos Iragora. I'm the director of Club de Prensa on the NTN 24 channel, and I'd like to thank the Brookings institutions. Among other things, this is the first time that the Brookings institutions, which is considered so prestigious by the University of Pennsylvania, that it has a forum in Spanish. And I'm very thankful and grateful because it's not just an initiative of Brookings, but also of CERES, who is directed by Ernesto Talvi. And if it wasn't for Julio Ruiz and our colleague here, this would not have been possible. All the guests for being here. I have Augusto de la Torre, who is the chief economist for Latin America and the Caribbean of World Bank. We also have Robert Rennig. He is the deputy director of the Western Hemisphere Department of the IMF. Thank you. We have Jose Juan Ruiz. He is the chief economist of the IDB. Ernesto Talve, the director of Brookings-CERES. And as I said, we have Moni Jensen with us. And the title of this forum is Latin America Prepared to Resist the Turbulent Global Economy of the World Economy. And I'd like to give the floor to Ernesto Talve so he can answer this question. Ernesto, thank you very much, Juan Carlos, for that introduction. Well, midst 2012, when the crisis was at its peak in Europe, Latin America also experienced a decline. China was cooling off. Commodities were going back to the prices of 2004. The interest rates were going up. And many economies were cooling off in a significant way. And so Argentina and Venezuela are going to come up in this conversation because they are not typical. And we're also going to talk about Brazil, Chile, Colombia, Peru, and Mexico. We can say that in similar circumstances in the past, we would already be seeing reserves fleeing, debt crisis, crisis with regard to currency, perhaps coup d'etats, and so much has changed since then. So that with the international liquidity levels that we have, with the capitalized private banking and stable political systems, we think that the problems will come through other traditional kinds of mechanisms on the monetary side, for example. In this regard, the governments are going to have to balance and adjust as they can to the new situation and take measures. This means in monetary terms, they're going to see a depreciation of currency in order to be competitive and also to deal with any recession pressures and also maintain the stability of prices. And those that have low growth rates can afford not to raise interest rates or even lower them, and also allow inflation to go above targets without committing or without compromising their credibility. However, Brazil cannot do that. They don't have that luxury. They're going to have to raise interest rates to try to keep their credit rating high, but also they need to deal with these recessive pressures. Now, we have other challenges to deal with. We need to be, or governments need to balance the adjustments to new circumstances and maintain credibility, creditworthiness, and also the capacity to pay the debt. Those that are beginning this process with low deficits and limited debt, like Peru, well, they have a great deal of leeway to, over time, have fiscal consolidation without making abrupt kinds of adjustments, which would bring pressure of recession. But Brazil, that has has high deficit, high debt, is going to be obliged to make immediate adjustments in order to shore up its credibility and also its public finance creditworthiness. To some, we have these external circumstances, and so all countries are going to have to go through surgery. It's going to be more or less, but we're going to have to go through surgery. We need a surgeon that can be effective and can be precise. And the issue is that what we're seeing with this cooling off, a stagnation of salaries and increase in unemployment, is that the popularity of presidents in exercise and popularity of governments have declined in almost all Latin American countries. But the good news is the following. In most of the countries, this has not translated into a lack of governance or paralysis. But in Brazil, unfortunately, the largest country in the region, the decline in popularity of the president and the approval ratings of the government has gone hand in hand with the Petrobras scandal. And we do have a paralysis of governance, and that means that there's no surgeon heading this up in a moment when they needed very deep measures. If we are going to sum it up, those from the TPP are going to have to go through painful adjustments, but not traumatic in our opinion. Brazil is in a very complex process without leeway with regard to fiscal and monetary policy and great deal of political fragility and a lack of investment. And in my opinion, this could lead very quickly, or in some months, to having Brazil go to the IMF in order to have an orderly adjustment, although they have a high volume of reserves still. But we can debate this later. We need to talk about the nuances with regard to the multilateral organizations. The scenario that I see, Robert, is that the IMF is going to be going around our region with some programs which are going to be needed in some countries. And the development banks, I think they're going to play a very key role to be able to facilitate what we like to call intelligent austerity in those countries that have solid macroeconomic fundamentals but are going to have difficulty in accessing credit. And the multilateral organization, the IDB, CAF, World Bank can play an important role. They have access to resources which are available in the world, and they can take them to Latin America and the emerging countries to finance profitable projects, both economically and socially profitable. It's interesting, and I'd like to conclude by summing up what I said. This world seems to be a world of more traditional problems. The issues are on the fiscal and monetary side, unemployment, some institutional political challenges, of course, and also the multilateral side, the IMF playing its traditional role of instituting programs with countries that need it, supervising macroeconomic fundamentals in those countries that don't need financing, and the development banks financing projects, and also looking at the nuances. This is for Augusto. You said that Augusto is divided between those who are, let's say, in the U.S. group and in the China group. Do you think that all countries will be able to meet these challenges? Thank you very much for allowing me to be here and to speak with my friends and colleagues. As Ernesto said, we have been adjusting to external factors for 4 years, and these external conditions have to do with what's happening in China. And if we had been here 15 years ago, we wouldn't be talking about China, because what was happening in China had no importance for Latin American economies, and the world has changed. And now China is very important, especially for South America. That means that the current external circumstances, well, South America, it has to absorb an external shock that is greater than in North America. Mexico, Central America, the Caribbean are following the U.S. recovery, and we have then South America that is going through an experience where they are actually experiencing this decline of China. So we have this bifurcation in the world. And the world has two groups, the U.S. helping to spur growth through consumption, and then we have China. And I think the biggest risk is that these two cycles, the one in the U.S. and China, go off path, and China does worse than we think, and that could bring the U.S. down and the rest of the world down if there was deacceleration. We hope that that doesn't happen, but that's what concerns me. Now, the region is adopting to these new conditions, these new external conditions, and what I'd like to emphasize with regard to what Ernesto has said, well, it's different to do macroeconomy in Latin America than in U.S. In the U.S., well, every 80 years there's a large crisis, but during the other 80 years, well, the U.S. grows 2% year over year. So you just need to soften the cycle so that there is stable growth. But in Latin America, we have to do that. And what is even more complicated, the trends change. So now we're facing a changing trend. So the counter-cyclical policies that we have available is limited. So we need to have a new balance in the macroeconomy that's less favorable, and that's difficult. And that is a task that is much more complicated than just managing the cycles. We're going in a transition phase. And of course, this is much more difficult than we thought. It's not causing financial crises like we saw in the 90s or the 80s. It is has to do with difficulties with regard to labor markets and price adjustments. And so these are new processes for the region. The region is learning through this process, through variables and spheres of the macroeconomic policy that are quite different from what they faced during times of financial or banking crisis. And in this process, there are some countries that are suffering more than others, depending on the magnitude of the adjustment, also the availability of instruments, in particular countries that can have flexible exchange rates. And they have an advantage versus, for example, Ecuador that cannot change its exchange rate to absorb this. So in my opinion, the adjustment process to external conditions has not finished. We have not reached bottom. When you look at the macro situation of Latin America, we believe that the only country that has touched bottom is Chile. However, there are more complicated policy questions in Chile, which is stopping it from going back up. But I think there's a lot to be done, and a lot's going to happen. I think this year we've had almost zero growth, and there's a lot to absorb. And this is true in the labor market. In the past, the labor market in Latin America always was accompanied by great inflation. Usually, if there were crises, there was great inflation. This ate away at salaries, real salaries, and we are not in the Latin America of the past. The inflation is low, and we're not so worried about that. So we have a more complicated labor market, and we're seeing what's happening. Employment's going down. The quality of employment is changing. The workers that were working in large companies are going into smaller companies with less salary. Those who had low salaries are going into their own businesses. And there's an adjustment process in the growth of salaries. And I think that that's a very important question with regard to social policy, whether this adjustment of the labor market will be regressive. And remember that Latin America in the last 15 years was one of the few regions in the world where we had a reduction in inequality of income, and that we're happy about that. And now we're at the low point in the cycle. The question is whether there will be greater inequality in income. We think yes, but it's going to be different. In the labor market, there is more unemployment. There is an increase in unemployment, as I said, and then we see young people who have least amount of education and who are men. They're the ones that are going into the labor markets. That's affecting the income of poorer families. And so we think that part of these social tensions will come from trying to absorb these labor market adjustments. And that means that we might lose out on some of the gains as far as income inequality is concerned. Now, I have a question for Mr. Renkar for the IMF. What you call these counter-cyclical policies, before we came in, you said that you wanted me to ask you about these kinds of policies. And I told you not everyone here is an economist, and perhaps in simple words or simple terms, you can explain this to us. Well, the interesting thing is what we are experiencing in the global economy is quite different from what we saw in 2008, 2009. With the global financial crisis, everyone implemented what we call counter-cyclical policies, designed to foster growth when they were facing this shock. In Latin America, that meant a greater public spending, a less tax income, and also lower interest rates and depreciation of currencies. Now the region is facing another kind of shock. It's an ongoing shock. The exchange rates, the prices of commodities are lower, and this is something that is sustained over time. So this means that the region should not necessarily implement counter-cyclical policies because there's not enough of leeway to do so. On the tax side, the fiscal side, the fiscal deficit, it's a weaker position than before. Public debt is higher as compared to 2008, and the level of public spending is higher, and it's more permanent. And those that export raw materials or commodities have less tax base or fiscal income. So there's less leeway for fiscal adjustments to spur growth. Now, with regard to monetary and exchange rate policies, countries, Chile, Mexico, Brazil, their currency have depreciated on the exchange rate markets. That's good. And in Chile and Colombia, for example, the depreciation of the currency has an effect on inflation. They need to raise interest rates to actually control inflation or expectations of inflation. But the most important point is that this is an ongoing shock. And so we have the potential growth at midterm is less than some years ago. So we have to emphasize the fact that we need structural reforms to diversify exports and help their economies. Many reforms could take place. For example, the rule of law, intellectual property rights, more competition in markets. So the private sector needs to look for new sources of growth. And the region is still not open, really, very much to international trade. And perhaps we need more international cooperation to have trade amongst Latin American countries. I think the important point is that this is a more permanent situation globally, and we need structural reforms in order to foster growth in the medium term.
Juan Luis, just a few years ago, Luis Alberto Moreno, the president of the IDB, published a book on the decade of Latin America. There was a lot of excitement about this. Nobody was expecting this hole we're in, but things have changed. Some of the statistics published in early October in Lima after their meetings, where they talked about the region's economy this week, they estimated that Venezuela will grow by 10%, Brazil 3%, Ecuador 0.6%. And the economies of Asia Pacific are better: Mexico, Colombia, Peru, and Chile. So my question to you is, are there reasons then to be pessimistic, or do you think we can still be slightly positive? Thank you very much. And thank you to Ernesto and Robert and to Channel N24 for inviting me. I think one of the advantages of being the last one to speak is that I can simply confirm the ideas that my president had about this. In recent meetings, we have not heard the term that I thought the one that was going to guide the conversation, which is the lost opportunity in Latin America. I don't think that's the case. What we're talking about here is something quite different. What we're talking about is how Latin America is once again asking this systematic question that it asks all the time of how it's going to address development, taking into account how the region has changed because of the opportunities that Latin America did take advantage of in this past decade. I think the best way to look at the opportunities that were made the most of is to look at three different figures, put them into like a trinity, a triangle, as it were. So we have 0%, then we have 66%, and we have 17%. Those three figures correspond to different vertices. So that is the economy, 0% growth. 66% is the number of Latin Americans who themselves state that they are part of the middle class, and 17% is the number of countries in the region and that in their constitutions have ongoing re-elections for president. These have a lot to do with each other. The opportunities that were taken advantage of in Latin America are in the social and political pillar. 30 years ago, you were talking about, Augusto was talking about China 15 years ago, but if 30 years ago somebody had asked what the political outlook for Latin America would be 3 decades later, it would have been very unlikely that they would say that this is a continent that 30 years after the democratic wave, the third democratic wave in the world would be consolidated. The answer that Latin Americans have said that they might be more or less pleased and that there are certain weaknesses still in their economies, but democracy has been consolidated effectively in the region. The citizens of Latin America still have unfinished business, and that is we have democracy, but we're not modern states that are able to offer the public goods and services that will help to make the leap toward development and the institutional capacity necessary to take this on. So the opportunity that was taken advantage of was democracy. And so we could say that the unfinished business is the modern state and how to overhaul the system of elites and to ensure that institutions are able to extend democracy to the majority of citizens. And then the other side, we have 66% of society, and 66% consider themselves to be part of the middle class. And this is the outcome of 15 straight years of sustained growth. This 66% has a great deal to do with how we're going to face the future based on something Augusto brought up. Much of the mythology as to how this middle class came to be has to do with the idea of profits, not the prices of commodities and the profits therefrom have been spread amongst the population, and this has had a major impact towards improving conditions. But this technology transfer has to do with 1% of GDP. And the truth is the middle classes and the World Bank did an exhaustive study about this. This growth of the middle class comes from job creation, and this is what has led to the creation of the middle class and improvements in reducing inequality, income inequality, because wages of unskilled laborers have jumped higher than those of skilled laborers. So Latin America has something to thank the state for, but a great deal of the reason behind the fact that they're part of the middle class, but it's vulnerable, but it's because the labor market is growth. So what is happening in these two different pillars? Well, and these two bases of the triangle depends on what happens at the point of the triangle. It has to do with the political system. And this is what Robert from the IMF and Ernesto were saying. There's the possibility of implementing counter-cyclical measures. Can the government do that? And how are we going to adjust to new conditions? This interaction is what's going to define the future in Latin America. Without growth, volatility is going to be much greater. And growth, we know how it appears. It's a medium and long-term reforms, adjustments, as Ernesto was talking about, and the ability to have integration processes underway in the region. Many experiments have been done trying to combine political, social, and economic aspects. In the 80s, they decided to leave the middle class and the impact on society to one side. And first, the major macroeconomic balances had to be struck because, and they had to legitimize these governments. And then looking at equity. This is the history of Latin America in the 80s and 90s. I don't think that's possible nowadays. I don't think we can talk about readjusting the region's economies at the cost of moving backwards in processes to improve income and wealth distribution and have inclusive economies. Equity is no longer under discussion in Latin America alone. It's something global, and you can't implement policies the way they were implemented in the 80s and 90s. This is not going to go anywhere socially or politically because society is going to have something to say about it. As we've seen in some examples, well, okay, if I forget about the macroeconomy and I'm just going to look at social policies, and I'll just forget about macro balances, and I'll just keep kicking the can down the road as long as I can. Sure, you can do that for a little time, but the macro indicators are going to impose the need to pay attention to them. So what we're discussing here is the capacity governments have to delay adjustments. And something important to think about here is if Latin America has learned anything from the past, it's the capacity power to dilute these adjustments. It depends on the institutions that have been created. It is not a coincidence that countries with strong currencies don't have inflationary pressures. In these countries that have good reputations and who have anchored the expectations to this. So it's not a coincidence that these countries that are talking about fiscal adjustments and that they can do them over 3 or 4 years, it's not a coincidence that this has not led to fiscal runs or exchange runs that we've seen in the past. They are now fiscal rules, transparent and well-known processes that are open to the public. So what are the constraints to continue to make intelligent adjustments? And the major item that's pending in the region in terms of growth and development is long-term reforms and the building of institutional capacity that will allow for intelligent and more focused adjustments. Looking at the discussions on government spending and institutions to be able to respond to shocks is going to be far more important than the actual size of the shock or the mistrust that investors have. And that's the major discussion on the table. I think the region has made strides in that sense, and so I'm not pessimistic. Okay, well, I wanted to talk about the 66% that Jose Juan talked about, the middle class. It has to do with jobs and their lack of satisfaction. Is this something good for democracy, that they're questioning the sitting governments? Or is this something that's a threat in that populist leaders might come to the fore? This has happened in Europe, and they don't have much political weight, but they're saying a lot. Well, this is certainly a challenge, Muni. It's a very significant challenge for the region, as Jose Juan was saying, in the adjustments and how they're prioritizing job creation, looking at young people who have low levels of education, but looking to create jobs for them. And middle classes are being threatened by recessive processes and adjustments in these social processes. I think we have to dissuade this idea of having populist proposals. And the way to do this is that governments and the established parties will have to internalize these policies and ensure that they're taking into account in their adjustment policies the need to expand and make opportunities more equal. This has to do with education and job training. If those things are not done and no resources are devoted to that, I believe, unfortunately, that there will be unrest in society and opposition to an entire process of adjustments, and it can undermine some of the achievements that were so hard won. I wanted to ask Mr. De La Torre and Remick and Jose Juan as well, what Latin American countries are doing well economically and what are not. I'm looking at the lack of satisfaction of middle classes with their governments. And Latino Barometer, they were saying that in 2009, approval ratings of sitting governments, of 17 governments, was 60%. Right now, it's 47%. So this is a very significant drop. So it gives the impression that Latin American citizens are bored with the current governments, the current administration. So what countries are doing well? I would like to talk about democracy before I get to your question, because I think it's key. It's true, as Jose Juan was saying, that the region is a region whose democracy is more well established now, but there are some serious challenges in terms of democracy, and I'd like to share what I think. There are a group of countries in the region where the quality of democracy has deteriorated. The checks and balances have been done away with for all intents and purposes. The balance of power has been weakened, and just the fact that they hold elections doesn't mean that there's operational representative democracy. This is very significant. There are 3 or 4 countries in the region whose democracies have deteriorated. Now, there are some countries with stronger democracies, and they have to have political debate, which is precisely what creates this lack of satisfaction. If we look at Chile or Brazil, democracy there has to process like a new social arrangement wherein there have to be more credible institutions. The relationship between the state and the market is discussed in a significant way there, and this is a test of the democracy, of entering into discussions and reaching new agreements. I think there's going to be democracy is going to be rather hard hit. For social progress to continue, there must be jobs. But the jobs from here into the future cannot be based on increased consumption as it was in the last decade. In last decade, growth was based on high levels of consumption. Now it has to be job creation with more moderate consumption that must be based on greater investments, more exports, and investment. It's not going to be easy to create jobs with this new economic dynamic. Think about now, there are countries that have devaluated a great deal in recent years, but their exports aren't necessarily growing. And if their exports don't grow, where are the jobs going to come from? But they do sometimes because we have a restricted capacity to create new exporting businesses. Our economies need to have a more competitive exchange rate, and it has to be favorably. But things aren't going so great in the world right now, and they're not sending enough products. But this is extremely important. And the last point on democracy that is of great concern to me is that the region has lost its ability to do self-monitoring in terms of democracy. What they've done is they've seen situations where we've seen a deterioration of democracy. Let's think about Venezuela. The U.S. Government it has anyone in the U.S. government criticized Venezuela? No, the presidents of the region have remained silent. So there's this silence that does not help to strengthen democratic institutions in the region. Well, I'll be a little bit more specific than Augusto was. Well, at the end, he was specific. Okay, well, at the end of his remarks, he was. I think countries that are doing well economically are Mexico, Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Yes, I think the challenges are slightly different. Argentina is very complicated nowadays. The upcoming elections, and it looks at the speed of the adjustments that are going to have to be implemented in 2016. It's not a question of whether adjustments need to be made, it's when. Brazil is complicated, but the Petrobras scandal has its positives and negatives. What's good is that they're tackling a major corruption scandal head on, and this means that 10 years from now, it's going to be a much stronger country. Venezuela, obviously, is a very complicated situation. There's no good management there in any way, shape, or form. Ecuador also has problems because of its dollarization. The government recognizes the need to implement adjustments, but it has no option to devaluate its currency. Jose Juan? Having heard what Augusto was saying, and I was first thinking about Latin America, but then the chip switched over to Europe, and I thought, okay, let me put myself in Europe and consider democracy. They have the same concerns there, the same concerns that Augusto was noting in Latin America. Those exist in European countries as well. That's where you have these moral values of European countries, but now we're seeing what's happening with the migration crisis and who's raising their hand to help. So at the end of the day, Augusto's points, which are extremely important, bring to bear what I was saying at the beginning, that Latin American democracy is not unique anymore. It faces the same problems that any democracy faces, which is what your conclusion was at the end. And at the end of the day, this is a complicated world. We don't know how to grow. We've lost sight a little bit of the context that Augusto brought up in China, where there's stagnation, but that doesn't mean that there's no ability for growth. I remember when in Latin America, it isn't so different from the rest of the world. we were always the outliers in the global economy, and we were simply showcasing what was happening. But now we face the same problems that other countries do. And this is one of the results of globalization, and all governments in the world are worried about the needs and the technology revolution for the disabled, and all governments of the world are worried about how cohesive their societies are and how they're growing, even though it's true that there are weaknesses and checks and balances in countries. So we're not so different, and we were able to make the most of the past 15 years. Not to mention some hopeful situations, but it does seem that some countries are moving towards more democratic systems and that are friendlier to freedoms, like is the case of Cuba, and the possible repercussions that that will have on the region. And the second item that's important: who's doing well, who's doing poorly. If we look at this exclusively from the standpoint of policy outcomes, I don't think that's the right way to proceed. What countries have truly put the medium term on their agendas and institution building and strengthening on the agenda? These countries continue to rely on commodities where external cycles explain 80% of our economic cycles. This has been the truth for the past 100 years. And so how are we going to tackle these challenges so that we're consistently on top of the trend? We have to have more diversified economies and institutions that are better able to absorb or help in the case of shocks. That's the medium and long term in the region. With all difficulties and all the gradual movement, I do see progress in these countries that we've noted. It's not a coincidence that Peru, Colombia, Chile, and Mexico have central banks with very good reputations. They have fiscal rules in place. They have checks and balances and economic governance. Obviously, there's still much more to be done, but with this institutional building, I think it might help us to at least put to one side the enormous volatility that is sometimes a result of policies implemented, but it's because we are so vulnerable to the international economic conditions. And okay, which countries make you lose sleep? Which make you feel good? Well, you're quite. So, which economies make us lose sleep? I already discussed it, and it has a lot to do with the question. Those that make me see the silver lining, the light at the end of the tunnel, are well, and somebody said, and I don't remember who said that we've forgotten a few things in terms of development, but that there's not one single experience in the history of development, not a single one, that has not resulted from very significant entrance or penetration into the international economy, more foreign direct investment, more trade, etc. So there's been great prosperity in the world as a result of trade and the freest and broadest trade possible. So what I'm seeing here are a very important thing based on what we're seeing in the new geographies of international negotiations. We have the TPP, which is basically the U.S. And Asia, Japan, and some other smaller players, and then the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership between the United States and Europe. So that's the next generation of trade agreements that go beyond the World Trade Organization, and they're designed to address issues that are not easily resolved among 66 countries. For example, government procurement, intellectual property, leveling the playing field within countries so that other countries can participate. These are very complex issues that will be done amongst a few countries, and then the rest of us will join in. So the Pacific Alliance, they themselves have this 2.0 TPP. And it has to do with what's happening in the global economy. Three of them are already part of the TPP. So I see these countries working very aggressively to be part of the 21st century's integration. Now, if I'm going to be a pessimist and say, well, what's happening on the Atlantic side, as you were saying before the meeting when we were talking about Brazil, Argentina, Venezuela, and here is where I see another light at the end of the tunnel, even though there's so many problems, and that is the private sector in Brazil, even in light of what I've said right now, has realized that the path they're taking is going to more absolute and total isolation. And therefore, old protectionist measures and reflexes don't work, and the private sector in Brazil is fighting for greater international penetration. So I think the political dynamic is going to catch up with the needs of the private sector. And then in the next 25 years, we're going to see a much more aggressively integrated Latin America in the world. And this is going to help the continent to grow more. Well, what about the productive sector? Are they going to be able to build this free trade road, as it were? When they create these structures, these continental highways, and they continue to export the same products to the same exact markets. So there need to be parallel efforts by the governments to have a diversity in exports, because that's what will sustain growth. Yes, to a certain degree, what you've said, we have to look at this figures. If you look at the exports in countries now and the structure of exports compared to 25 years ago, even if it's just in the case of China, it's changed, either the markets or the products. So the export diversification in the continent should be greater. That's likely true. And that's likely where we could, right now, in times of low growth, start to think about some public policy actions that could be taken, or reject them because it's not suitable to talk about public policies for economic adjustment, they don't enjoy consensus, or because they're external uh, factors like the exchange rates that have an impact on this. Likely, right now, what we should do is look for growth within the region, and because world economic growth is lower right now, and look at the reactions in the real exchange rates. There are businesses that you couldn't have had in 2009, 2010, 2011 because the competitiveness of the manufacturing sector was affected by real exchange rates. This is likely where we're going to see the most possibility for short-term growth. More that bringing together these two things: first, greater regional integration, and secondly, productive activities that are a little bit more diversified and than what we've seen in the past 20 years when we're talking about the dependence on commodities. But now commodity prices are low. So this is the time when there's probably the likelihood that you could have public policies be implemented that in the past had no chance.
Well, we could think about Brazil, which is traditionally a protectionist country, and they produce airplanes. And Colombia, which is a snowbound country, continues to produce coffee. There is the aeronautics industry in Mexico, which actually has a turnover of 30% more than Brazil. I don't think Colombia has failed because it doesn't produce planes, rather is with regard to manufacturing, etc. If we look at the sophistication of planes are impressive because of their size, but if you look at the degree of sophistication, it's not even 7 or 8% of the products that the country produces and exports and require sophistication for production. And you look at countries that have economies based on commodities, New Zealand, Australia, where the agricultural base is very large, where they produce milk, meat, which is not very sophisticated, but they have gone up the chain, let's say. They now export 65% of their package. And it's very sophisticated. So it's not some activities are going to substitute others. In the development process is that you continue to do what you've always done, but you broaden things so you can become more sophisticated. But what we need are two things: institutions, and this also requires a labor force that is highly qualified, highly skilled, and we don't have that in Latin America. If we had those two things, we had also integration in markets that would allow us to take advantage of them. We could, end up having a very good educational system like, we could avoid ending up like Cuba that has a well-educated labor force, but everyone is underemployed. So I'd like to let Augusto comment. I like the fact that we're talking about international trade integration because it seems to me this is an area that has not been exploited in the region to spur growth. And this is complicated, as we have said. There are different agendas that need to be implemented. In my opinion, I think we need to make a psychological jump. In the past, Latin America had integration on one side that was regional and other that was international, and we had steps to have different trade agreements within the region, thinking that that was a better bet than having international integration. But the Chileans did go for international integration, but it's not a choice here, not one or the other. When we look at Asia, Southeast Asia, we have integration in the region and internationally. And with more regional integration, they have more effective exports to be integrated in the world. So this is a virtuous cycle to have both kinds of integration. In Latin America, we haven't known how to take advantage of this cycle that is virtuous. We need both kinds of integration, and we could grow much more if we could integrate in the world and amongst ourselves. And amongst ourselves, the more we integrate in the world. So we have some minutes for a few questions from our audience, maybe 3 questions. And please say your name before your question. And a question, please, not a comment or editorial opinion. For the IMF representative, you mentioned that the IMF can go back to its traditional role in Latin America. Do you agree with that? What countries would be the ones where the IMF would be intervening, except for Brazil, and perhaps Latin America also has bad memories of past IMF interventions? Well, it's very difficult, of course, to predict which countries are going to ask for financing from the fund. Brazil has not asked for anything from the fund. I don't know if they're going to. And there are countries that are in bad shape, but they're perhaps not the ones who are going to ask for help from the fund. And I'm always surprised how long countries can last out. Thank you. I'm not going to answer the question because I can't. It's impossible, absolutely impossible to predict who's going to ask for the fund to intervene. President Reagan once said, he said, instead of answering the questions, I'm going to actually talk about why I can't answer them. Please state your name and who the question is for. I'm Adriana Peralta. I work for Trust Network. I have a question for Ernesto. The conversation has been about Mexico and South America, but what do you think the outlook is for the Northern Triangle, in other words, Central America, which is suffering violence from drug trafficking and crime? Well, we're going to take questions. Well, let's have a few questions and then we'll answer all of them at once. Thank you very much. Now, with regard to Muni's concern about the sophistication or diversification of exports and the comment with regard to the sophistication of the export package, maybe one of the panelists could comment about the future. Well, what recommendations you would make to work on the sophistication of the export package given the new circumstances? Another question? Thank you. Anand Rosenberg. I think this is for Ernesto, but could be for anyone. You said that the problems have to do with integration in markets and the democratic system, but that means behind that there is a capitalist sector that wants to invest and also take on risks. And so what I am concerned about is that we're going to go back to our old ways. The private sector sometimes doesn't do what it's supposed to be doing. And here we have another question. The lady back here, yes? Good morning. Isabel Resante. I'm a collaborator of Caracas Chronicles, and my question has to do with the labor market. We have been glad because there has been growth in the middle class. But how much is that from the informal market? And now we're facing economic turbulence. How much of that middle class is going to face vulnerabilities and perhaps fall out of the middle class? Another question? Thank you. Paulo Pardo. I'm from El Mundo. For Mr. Werner from the fund. In the short term, everyone was expecting the increase in interest rates in the U.S. and its impact on Latin America. Now, this is being put off time and again, but prices are dropping and there's deflation. And so interest rates are growing in reality. Can this have the same impact on Latin America, the same impact that the rise in interest rates would have? And can this cause turbulence? Who would like to go first? Now I'm Mexican, says the gentleman. With regard to the Fed's impact, I don't think we're seeing deflation in Latin America, or no signs of it, or in the United States. For Latin America, the issue is whether for Latin America, it's whether the Fed will be increasing interest rates and when, and it depends on the country. For example, in Mexico, if the federal fund rate goes up and the U.S. economy recovers, this is good for Mexico because there is more demand for Mexican exports that are sold in the United States, and that is more important than the impact of the rise in interest rates. Now, for Latin American countries where the links to the U.S. are not as strong, the impact would be greater. So the rise in the rates by the Fed will have an impact on those countries. It will be slow down growth a bit. But I don't see signs of deflation in any country in the region. As a matter of fact, some countries have the highest inflation rates in the world, so I don't think that's a problem in our region. Mr. Talvi, I'm just going to answer one question because I think Jose Juan can speak to the question about Central America. And so I think Jose Juan can take that one on. Look, I just want to reflect on the idea of productive sophistication. It turns out we have Nicolas Herrera here, who's the vice president of our board and also president of the foundation Impulso, which is the first private secular school that is free in the most vulnerable neighborhood in Montevideo. And what was done was a revolution in management. I don't have time to go into it, but it's a different kind of management than what has occurred in traditional education structures that take children from very poor backgrounds who come out of elementary school, those who usually drop out, those who usually perhaps have problems with the law, and they are taken into an environment where, in addition to having great academic demands, it's also an environment where they are nurtured, which perhaps does not happen in their families, where they are told, well, welcome to life, which is what a friend of mine always says, right? I can assure you that when you see that firsthand, and you see the results and outcomes that you can achieve with young people who supposedly have no chance in life, that's when you really have hope. Those young people are going to have a future. They're going to think that maybe they have a future. They thought that they were going to drop out of school when they started, and now they think they're going to have a future. And with this, I'll conclude. The best predictor of upward mobility in studies that have been done here in the United States is to have a 4-year college degree. Thus, I think in a continent where 50% of young people, in keeping with international testing, cannot be employed by the formal economy because they do not have the minimum skills to work in a know-how economy, this is a society which, in its foundations, cannot imagine that this is where sophisticated products can be manufactured or made, because you need skilled labor. So that is the challenge the region is facing for equality, equality of opportunities, to fight against social exclusion. What we need is quality education, especially directed toward the vulnerable segments. And Jose Juan, I want to tell you something. Before, we thought we had to grow to include people. This logic that I explain means we need to include people to then grow. I'm very optimistic with regard to trade, but less optimistic that some reforms can go forward. But there are examples, there are some points of light out there that we're seeing, and hopefully government will emulate these models. And the other question? With regard to Central America, I think that there is an historical injustice. When we talk about Central America, we talk about Latin America, and we think that the drop in commodities is bad for the entire region. That's not the case for the Caribbean and Central America. It's quite the contrary. Central America imports commodities as well as the Caribbean. They're net importers of commodities. And yes, for them, it's a positive shock. This lower commodity prices, and secondly, a very high growth in the U.S., and they can actually benefit from that. You have to remember that remittances from immigrants are 12 to 18% of GDP, and any changes in migration laws could have a positive effect. Where are the big problems? You mentioned them. The weaknesses of the state, a state that actually has a monopoly over force and the use of force. And we see a citizen reaction, however, to this. I think that there have been changes in small countries, not just large countries. I think that countries that are facing pressing problems, they are reacting to the problems of safety and security, and middle classes are reacting. What is the possibility of short-term improvement? Well, it's a bit depressing, but Gordon Brown, the former Prime Minister of the UK, said to impose the rule of law. Well, the first 500 years are always the most difficult to do so. And I think it's a gradual process. But there is a change, I think, that has happened, a qualitative one. In 5 minutes, we'll start our second panel. Thank you, Augusto, Jose Juan Ruiz, Ernesto Talvi, and also our friend Robert Rennick.